Now, I don't want to go back through and review all of the respiratory anatomy. Basically, by now, I'm assuming you all know what the structure of the nose looks like, what the function of the nose is, right? So air is going to go through the nose, be moistened, filtered, warmed. Then the air goes through the parts of the pharynx. Nothing happens there. It's just going. Then the air goes through the larynx, where you have your voice production. You decide which way your food's going to go. If food goes one way, air goes another. Air continues down the trachea, goes through the bronchial tree. And what we're going to be looking at today is the physiology of what happens as we go from the bronchial tree and we get the oxygen we're trying to get in to go to our cells and the CO2 waste product out back to our lungs to go out of our body. Okay? To completely understand what is going on, we're going to have 3 parts we're going to go over. The first part is pulmonary ventilation. Okay. And the reason I wrote it at the top of the screen is because pulmonary ventilation is the process that occurs simply at the lungs. Pulmonary ventilation has absolutely nothing to do with going through the gases and figuring out what's good and what's bad. The purpose of pulmonary ventilation is to get the air into the lungs. Then we decide what to do with it. And pulmonary ventilation is the reverse. It's getting the air out of the lungs. Not deciding, oh, but I want to get rid of this, I just want to get rid of this. Just simply, here's the air, bring it in. Here's the air, get it out. That's pulmonary ventilation. Okay? Then we have to go over external respiration. I abbreviate. Okay? External respiration is the gas exchange between the lungs and the blood. So we all understand my crazy looking picture I've drawn, right? This thing up here at the top is supposed to be the lungs with the bronchial tree and the alveoli in it. This large oval looking thing, that's supposed to be the blood supply. Okay? Down here at the bottom, this is supposed to be a cell. This cell is actively working, so it's making CO2 waste product. Okay? Now the other process we're going to go over occurs down here, and that is internal respiration. Those are the 3 parts of respiration. Okay? Now we're also going to go over transport, which is how the blood gets things from one place to the other. But this is what respiration is. Okay? Transporting things is actually blood, and we've learned it before. We just review it in this chapter. Okay? Now, one thing I did differently today than I did the last time we went over this, when I drew this picture, was I put some hearts in there. Okay? Because I want to make sure that as we go through this, you don't forget what we've already gone through. Okay? So as an overview, these 3 processes, along with transport, the goal is going to be to pull air in, move oxygen from the lungs to the blood, right? And then the oxygen travels through the blood, goes to the heart. So this part of it would be the pulmonary vein, okay? Going back to the heart. Why does it go through the heart before it goes to the cells out in the body that need the oxygen? To get your pressure built up, right? So you can pump and get the blood to go as far as it needs to go, right? So then that oxygenated blood comes out of the heart through the aorta, then goes to the body where it's needed, right? Then we're going to pick up our CO2. CO2 travels through the body and the blood, back to the heart through the what? The vena cava, right? Through the heart, out the pulmonary artery, back to the lungs, and then the CO2 goes out. So that's the whole process. We pretty well understand that. We kind of already knew we needed to get oxygen in and get CO2 out. Now what we're focusing on today is understanding what are the driving forces that allow the oxygen to go the right way and the CO2 to go the right direction. Okay? So we'll go through each one. What I did yesterday, and I think it worked really well, is first let's just follow the oxygen till we get it where it belongs. So that will actually only be half of pulmonary ventilation because we're only going to breathe in at first. We're just worried about getting the oxygen in, okay? So if we do the first part, and I'm going to do, let's do oxygen in red. Okay, so let's see what happens with the oxygen. So step 1, pulmonary ventilation. I need to pull the air into my lungs, right? Okay. Now, is oxygen the only gas that I bring in? No, but for purposes of this, I'm just going to write oxygen where it doesn't get all crowded. Okay? Now, what caused that oxygen to come in? What is the first thing I have to do, the first step of pulmonary ventilation to get that oxygen into my body? Okay, we've got to change pressure. We can't just change our pressure. What do we change? And then pressure responds to it. The muscles contract to change the volume, right? So the first thing that happens in pulmonary ventilation, muscle contracts, and I know we've already written this somewhat, but let me write it again. Muscle contracts. What muscles? Intercostal muscles and large muscle right here. Diaphragm. Good. Okay? So all those muscles contract. When those muscles contract, what happens to the size of your lungs? It expands. So when we contract those muscles, we increase the volume of the lungs. Some guy with the last name Boyle figured out that any time you increase the volume, what happens to the pressure? It goes down. Volume and pressure are inversely proportional. Means they're opposite of each other. Okay? So now we have low pressure in the lungs, high pressure outside the body. Which way does a gas always flow? From high pressure to low pressure. So if the pressure is high outside, air flows into the lungs where there's lower pressure. That's the first part. Does everybody understand that? Okay? So we have high pressure outside the lungs. We have low pressure in the lungs. So air flows from high pressure outside the body to the low pressure inside the lungs. Okay? And when you're taking a test and you're trying to, and I'm going to give you scenarios like that. I'm going to say you need to take a breath in so you contract your muscles. Okay? Which way is the air going to flow, or where's the pressure going to be higher? I'm going to give you scenarios. Always sit down and think, okay, well, she said I'm breathing in. So that means I want the air to go in. So always know that's the ultimate, that's the end goal. And then just think about, okay, I want my air to flow in. So that means inside has to have low pressure. So you can kind of work your way around it knowing which way you want the air to go. Okay? Since we knew we were trying to get oxygen in, then I need my air to come in. Does everybody understand that? From high to low. Always flows to lower pressure. From high to low. However it's easier for you to say it. Just air flows to the low area or air flows from high to low. Whatever's easier for you. It all means the same thing. Okay? That is the first part of pulmonary ventilation. Everybody understand that? I need to get rid of those P's so I don't confuse myself. Okay? Everybody good? All right. So now let's look at the first part of external respiration. Okay? We're now talking about what's going on between the lungs and the blood. Okay? We have just taken a big gulp of air in, and now we have the oxygen in our lungs. So what are we going to be trying to do right now at this point in this diagram in external respiration? We're going to be trying to exchange from the lungs to the blood, and what do we want to move? The oxygen from the lungs to the blood, right? So that's our end goal. Let's make sure we understand that first. Now let's understand why it goes that way. Okay, it's not good enough for us to just say that's what I want to happen. There has to be science. There's be physics. There's a reason that it moves that way. Okay? Well, we just took a big, deep breath of air in. So where do we have more oxygen? In the lungs or in the blood? You have more in the lungs. Why? We just put it in there, right? Everybody's with me? Okay? So we right now at this point have a high concentration of oxygen in our lungs. And then some guy named Dalton told us that if we have a high concentration, what does that mean about the pressure? You have a high pressure. So high concentration equals, that's supposed to be high pressure. Okay? So we have high pressure in the lungs, lower pressure in the blood. Which way is the oxygen going to flow? To the blood, because the gas always flows from high pressure to low pressure. Right? Let's say it again, make sure everybody gets it. We just took a big deep breath in. So that means we have more oxygen in the lungs. If you have a high concentration of oxygen in the lungs, you have a high pressure in the lungs. Since the pressure is high in the lungs, the air flows from the lungs to the blood. So it goes from the lungs to the blood. Now we're done with external respiration. Make sense? Okay. Now that oxygen is going to go through the blood. We all know it doesn't just magically float on its own, right? But we'll review that in a minute. Let's just finish this first. Okay. Once the oxygen keeps flowing, it gets down here, out in the body where we need it. And now we're ready to go over the first part of internal respiration. What's the end goal? What are we ultimately trying to do with the oxygen? From the blood to the cells, right? That's what we're ultimately trying to do. Where do we have a higher concentration of oxygen? Where do we have more? In the blood or in the cell? I heard both answers. Think about it. Where do we have more? What was the end goal? To get it to the cell, right? So where must we have more of it now? You have more in the blood because you're trying to get it to the cell. Everybody got it? So in the blood, we have a high concentration of oxygen. High concentration means that there's a what pressure? High pressure, directly proportional. Air always flows from high pressure to low pressure, right? So if the pressure is higher in the blood, the oxygen is going to flow from the blood down into the cell. Okay, tell me what you think you missed. Right? Yes. The pressure is only down. Okay. So when volume goes up, that makes the pressure go down, so air comes in. Now that the air is in there, yeah, the pressure goes up again. Because the way we're explaining this is little piece by little piece. It's not the way your body works, right? Your body doesn't go, and then hold it in there while you get the oxygen where you want it to go, right? So in real life, what you would do is go, you breathe in. No, you inhaled, pressure went up, so you exhale. Pressure's down, you inhale. Pressure goes up, you exhale. Then you breathe again. Volume expands, pressure goes down, so you inhale. What I think is confusing you is that we're not doing everything simultaneously. We're kind of just seeing what the oxygen did before we explain that, yeah, the air does have to go back out. But in real life, you breathe in, breathe out. Breathe in, breathe out. Does that help? This does not happen step by step. This is all just happening all the time in your body. The only way to explain it is to look at one piece at a time. It's a domino effect. That's a very good way of looking at it. Right? In order to get the oxygen to go into the blood, we had to breathe. In order to get our oxygen to our cells, we had to get it from our lungs to our blood. Right. Anytime we're looking at pressures, you're not just saying pressure's high. It's always higher than. You're always comparing two areas. So when we look at the first part, pulmonary ventilation, we're comparing the pressure outside the body and the pressure in the lungs. We don't really care what's going on in the blood at that time. We're comparing the two. Then when we look at external respiration, we're comparing pressure between the lungs and the blood. We're not worried about what's outside the body anymore. Sort of. You're thinking about it right, but you're thinking about it too hard because anytime you can say to yourself, if the concentration's high, the pressure's high, right? Yes. See, let me tell you guys something. You are all saying the same thing. You're all just saying it your own way. And there's nothing wrong with that. And I always want you guys to say things because sometimes the way I'm saying it isn't going to make sense to everybody, but the way you say it may. But you're all saying the right things. You just got to get it straight in your mind. What we just went over was 1/2. Okay? So I'm going to do it all again real quickly, and I just want you guys to listen as I point and make sure it all makes sense before we do the other half. Okay? So I need to breathe. That's the point we're at the beginning. In order to do that, so I'm not breathing. Pressures are fairly equivalent between outside and inside. The only way I can get my air in is to contract the muscles around my lungs, which causes the volume to go up. When the volume goes up, that decreases the pressure inside my lungs. Okay? It doesn't make the pressure go away, it just decreases it, it lowers it. Now that the pressure in my lungs is lower than the pressure outside my body, air flows in. Now I've gotten air in there. Okay? Well, what's my body going to do with it? Yes, in real life, your body's going to blow it back out. But before it does that, inside your lungs has a high amount of oxygen. You just put it in there. High amount or high concentration means higher pressure in one area than another. So at that point, after we just took this big breath of air in, the high pressure, high concentration of oxygen and high pressure of oxygen moves the oxygen from the lungs to the blood. Okay? Once the oxygen makes its way to an area that we need it, now we'll have a high concentration of oxygen in the blood, meaning high pressure. The oxygen moves from the higher pressure in the blood to the cell where there's a lower pressure. It make more sense every time. Every time we say it, it should make more and more sense until it becomes just, oh yeah, it's obvious, perfect. I don't know why I didn't get it the first time we said it, right? That's the goal. That's why we say it so many times. Yes, volume only matters in pulmonary ventilation because that's the only time we can change the volume. We can't just sit here and think and change the volume of our blood, right? It just doesn't happen. But we can change the volume of our lungs, right? So Boyle's law only matters when you're talking about lungs, which is pulmonary ventilation. After that, you just use Dalton's law, concentration compared to pressure. Okay? So y'all ready to look at what happens the other direction? Believe it or not, it's easier because by now you should be able to make these comparisons to each other a little easier. Okay? So we're going to start with internal respiration because now we're going to talk about CO2, and it goes the other way, right? Everybody understands that because we make the CO2 in our body and we need to get it out. Okay? So at this point down here in the cell, we have a whole bunch of CO2 in this cell and outside this cell. Now let's not forget why. Why do we have all of this CO2 in this cell? When do you make that? When you use the oxygen to make energy, CO2 is your waste product. So if this is the cell that needed oxygen, he's going to have a whole bunch of CO2 because he's been working. Okay? Everybody knows that. Okay? So where do we have a lot of CO2? We have a high concentration of CO2 in the cells. High concentration always tells us we have what kind of pressure? High pressure. Did a T again. I keep wanting to write toilet paper. High, I don't know what my deal is. High pressure of CO2 in the cell. Air flows from the high pressure in the cell to the low pressure in the blood so that we can get our CO2 into our blood. Now the CO2 travels through the blood, okay, to the heart. Eventually, we get the CO2 in the blood back to the area of the lungs. Yes, I know we're leaving something out, but we're going to go back and review transport in a minute. Okay? So now we got that CO2 at our lungs. Right? High concentration of CO2 in the cells means we have high pressure. So CO2 moves from the area of high pressure in the cell to the blood. Okay? Travels through the blood until we get to the area around the lungs. Now, where do we have a higher amount of CO2 if we compare the blood to the lungs? In the blood. How do we know that? Because we just had all this ATP making going on. We just put all the CO2 in the blood and we brought it back to the lungs. So we did that so we could get the CO2 out of the body. So that must mean we're going to have a ton of CO2 in the blood, right? So now we have high concentration of CO2 in the blood. That tells us we have a what? High pressure of CO2 in the blood. The CO2 is going to go from high pressure to low pressure. So the CO2 goes from the blood into the lungs. Everybody's to that point? All we have left is pulmonary ventilation, which means we got to get that air out. Okay? So now, to get the air out, we're going to do the opposite of what we did to get the air in. To get the air in, what did we do? Contracted the muscles to increase the volume, right? So to get the air out, we're going to relax the muscles, which will decrease the volume, right? Everybody's, yeah. I'm going to write it just kind of down here at the bottom because I'm running out of room. Good. You guys are getting it. So we relax the muscles. When we relax the muscles, that does what? Decreases the volume, right? If you decrease the volume of the lungs, what happens to the pressure? You increase pressure. Always opposites. So now I have high pressure in my lungs, right? So high pressure in my lungs. Which way does air like to go? High pressure to low pressure. So we have higher pressure in the lungs. Air is going out of the body. Okay? So you see when we finish, you can follow everything through an exact pathway. In real life, it's all happening at the same time. But to watch it piece by piece, you can see what's happening at each point. Okay? This is the shortest test you take all semester. I think it's actually only 40 questions. Because there's only so many things I can ask. And I think you need a little longer to answer each question. Where normally it only takes you a minute or two to answer each question. When I ask you a question about pressure and concentration, I expect you to have to think about it for a minute or two. So that's why I make the test a little bit shorter. It's not that I think it's harder, I just think you have to think about it. You can't just spout out answers. In your quizzes and homeworks you've been doing, you should have sample questions. I mean, ask yourself a sample question. Give yourself a scenario. I just took a breath in. What's the pressure? Compare pressures. I mean, that's all I'm going to do to you. I'm going to say, give you a specific scenario, very specific. Yeah, so I'll say, you want to take a breath in. You contract your muscles. That increases the volume. Where's the pressure higher? In the lungs or outside the body? All right. You just went to take a breath in. You've contracted your muscles. That increased the volume in the lungs. Where's the pressure higher? Outside the body or inside the lungs? Outside. You contract muscles. So what are you trying to do? Breathe in. So pressure's got to be higher outside so you can breathe in. Okay? You see, it's not a hard question, but you got to think about it. The first thing you do is think, what is my ultimate goal? What am I trying to do? Okay? Only thing left we need to make sure we understand. Do a different color, and you guys can flip to a different page or whatever you want to do. Only thing we haven't done is review what we did back in Chapter 17, which is understand how do we get that oxygen and that CO2 through our blood, all right? Because overall, we need the pH of our blood to stay correct, and we need to make sure we get the oxygen where we want it. We don't want that oxygen lollygagging and floating off into all the tissues that don't need it. We need it to stay compacted until we can get it to that area that really needs it. So what is the molecule called that we combine oxygen with so it can travel through our blood? Hemoglobin. Y'all should all know that by now. Come on. Hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is what we combine oxygen with to get it traveling through our blood. Okay? That's something we've been doing for a while. We can put 4 oxygens on every hemoglobin. The oxygen combines with the iron on the hemoglobin. Okay? Now, something a little new that we talked about this time, to make sure you understand why we do all of this, is every time that happens, hemoglobin grabs that oxygen and holds on to it so it can carry it where it needs to go. But it turns out it's kind of a bad thing, but when it does that, it releases this H+. That H+ has a very low pH. So we need to make something with high pH so they counteract each other, right? And I think that was you guys that came up with the good analogy that said +1 - 1 is 0. We want it to be neutral. We want them to cancel each other out. Okay? So this hemoglobin, with the oxygen attached, keeps going through our body. Now, when it gets to the point of this cell, the hemoglobin lets the oxygen go. Does anybody have any idea? Can you guess, how does the hemoglobin know that this is where it needs to let it go? Is there a high concentration of anything in this area that would trigger that the oxygen is needed? The CO2. Does everybody kind of understand that? The hemoglobin gets to this area and it says, whoa, lots of CO2. That means this cell's making energy. If he's making energy, he needs my oxygen. Here you go. Okay? That's the Haldane effect, and that's one of the last slides in your PowerPoint that we hadn't gone over yet. But I think it kind of makes sense now that we've been going through it, right? The hemoglobin knows this is an area that needs that oxygen because this is an area with a lot of CO2. Okay? Make sense? Oh, we're getting there. We're getting there. We're getting there. Okay? You're going too fast for me. I'm slow. Okay? Does everybody understand why the hemoglobin lets go of the oxygen at this point? Because the high concentration CO2 tells it that the cell needs the oxygen. Good. Okay? Everybody understands that we combine the oxygen with hemoglobin to sequester it, hold on to it, make sure we can get it where it needs to go. That's what we've done so far. Okay? Now what we're going to do is explain how we counteract that low pH. We need something high pH, right? Well, every time we put a CO2 in our blood, we have an enzyme called carbonic anhydrase that turns CO2 into HCO3 minus. That's bicarbonate. Okay? Here's the minus, right? The H had the plus on it. The HCO3 has the minus on it. This is going to be our high pH. Okay? And we said plus 1, minus 1 cancels each other out. So we make this molecule so we don't screw up our pH. There's no such thing as hydrogen carbonate. There is carbonic acid is what this is called without the minus on it. The molecule is just called bicarbonate. It does have a hydrogen and a carbonate ion together, but it's called bicarbonate is what you're thinking about. Okay? So the minus and the plus cancel each other out. Sometimes when you read your textbook, you're going to read the word buffer, and it's going to tell you bicarbonate's the buffer. Buffer simply means resist pH change. Is that what this is doing? Yeah, it's keeping the pH from changing. That bicarbonate says, crap, here's another H+, let me combine with it and get it out of the way. Just to buffer, just to keep the pH correct. Okay? Go ahead, ask a question. What makes it change from CO2 to HCO3? There's an enzyme always in your body. It's in your blood. It's actually in your red blood cells called carbonic anhydrase. That enzyme's only job in your blood, it is only there to convert the CO2 back and forth between CO2, HCO3 minus. If you have too much HCO3 minus, that enzyme will turn it back into CO2. Okay? The same enzyme can go back and forth. And that's actually what happens once we go back through our heart and we get back up here where we need it to be CO2 again. That same enzyme turns it back into CO2. Well, if you ask yourself, why bother changing it if I'm just going to change it back? Because we change it so it can cancel out that annoying H+ that's in the way, so we can keep our pH straight. Yes, having both of those keeps it from going too high or too low, keeps it right where it's supposed to be. Everybody understand that? Okay. It should, at this point, be 1,000 times easier than it was when you heard it on Tuesday. Is it? That's the goal. Okay? That's the goal. Now, here's my question for you. Do you think you understand it well enough that if you go home and spend time studying it, you will know it? I'm not going to ask if everybody knows it 100% right now because you hadn't had time to study it yet. Do you understand it well enough to study it so you can get it completely? You have no choice. That's a good answer. You cannot kidnap me and take me home with you, so I guess... But I'm recording this so you can take me home with you, right? You can listen if you want. Well, I did something for you guys yesterday, and it is on Blackboard. Let me open it up. I did something nice. I wrote out in words and summarized every single thing we just went over on that picture. I do love you guys, right? So, let's read through this and just see if everything makes sense. We have pulmonary ventilation. Its job, move the air in or out using muscles. Okay? So to inspire, we're trying to get oxygen in. Contract muscles to increase volume. Increase volume means low pressure. Air flows from the atmosphere to the lungs. Okay? The opposite, when we're ready to get CO2 out, we relax the muscles. That decreases the volume. Lower volume means high pressure in the lungs. So air flows from the lungs to the atmosphere. Okay, we got that part. Then, external respiration. By definition, gas exchange between the lungs and the blood. So half of it is we got to get the oxygen from the lungs to the blood. Why does that happen? High concentration of oxygen in the lungs means high pressure of oxygen in the lungs. So oxygen flows from the high to low pressure from the lungs to the blood. Okay? Opposite of that, we got to get the CO2 from the blood to the lungs, right? So we have more CO2 in the blood. High concentration means high pressure. CO2 moves from high to low, so it moves from blood to the lungs. Okay? Internal respiration, by definition, gas exchange between blood and cells or tissues in the body that need to have the gas exchange occur, tissues that are working. So we got to move the oxygen from the blood to the cell. Why does that happen? More oxygen in the blood means higher pressure of oxygen in the blood. So oxygen moves from the high pressure in the blood to the low pressure in the cell. Opposite of that, we got to get the CO2 from the cell to the blood. High amount of CO2 in the cell means high pressure of CO2 in the cell. So the CO2 moves from high pressure in the cell to the low pressure in the blood. Okay. Now that's all respiration. The transport, how do we get it back and forth where it needs to go? When it's oxygen, we combine it with hemoglobin. Okay? Oops, that made an H+ we got to worry about. How do we move the CO2? Some of it does combine with hemoglobin, but very little. Most of it we turn into bicarbonates. The reason we make the bicarbonate is to buffer. Keep the pH neutral. Cancel out the H+. So simple when you're just listening to it, right? Well, here's what you need to do. You need to study enough that you can say it like I just said it. Right? I wasn't reading the slide, right? I'm just saying it. If you study it well enough that you can say it to yourself, there's no question I can ask you that you won't be able to answer. That's your goal. If you understand, honestly, other than anatomy, if you understand what's on these 4 slides completely, you're fine, because this is a big summary of all of the physiology. No, it's immune system too. That's actually my next sentence. Okay, we haven't been tested on the immune system yet, right? Now, I told you immune system we weren't going to do anywhere near as in-depth as we did all the other systems. So before I let you go, let's make sure I ask you a couple questions about the immune system. Okay? The overall goal of the immune system is to do what? Protect your body from invasion, from anything foreign getting in there. There were 2 big parts of it, innate immunity and adaptive immunity. What was the innate immunity? Very, very good. What you're born with. That's your first and second line. It has no idea what it is that's attacking you. It's just saying something is coming into my body that is not supposed to be there. Okay, so that can be your skin keeping it out, or if it happens to get in a little bit, that's all those macrophages and neutrophils, those phagocytes, saying, crap, here's something that's not supposed to be here. Let me eat it and destroy it. Crap, here's something else. Let me eat it and destroy it. Okay? Very good. If you understand that, and I mean, some of you said it to me, so I know you understand it. You understand how innate immunity works. That's as detailed as we went. We did talk about inflammation, right? We said, we went over inflammation in a little bit more detail. We said inflammation occurs because some bacteria or something like that gets down under the skin. All those macrophages and neutrophils start attacking. New stuff from the blood comes out and starts helping, so it swells, you get pus, you get all that stuff because it's all coming from the blood trying to help. That's the only other thing we talked about when we talked about innate immunity. Now the harder one, adaptive immunity. How does adaptive immunity work? Okay. This is the part of it where they actually know what they're attacking. They get a big group effect going on, right? With the innate immunity, it was just one little neutrophil or macrophage grabbing it and eating it. With the adaptive immunity, You got your T cells and B cells kind of whispering at each other saying, hey, I see, you see this right here? We need to take care of this, right? It is the organized attack against something specific. So we would have the first guy that comes into play is our TH. And what does his H stand for? Helper. He's the helper. I think nosy is a better description of what he does. Because the little TH wants to run around and make sure everybody's doing what they're supposed to be doing. He's not really going to do anything himself. He's just going to check on everybody else, right? He's a real regulator. Well, the first thing he does is he lets this macrophage show him, very good, show him the antigen. He says, hey, look at this big triangle thing. Look what I found. We've been eating this stuff like crazy up there by the skin. You may want to work on this. This isn't called a macrophage anymore. What's he called? APC. And what does that stand for? Antigen presenting cell, right? So since we're activating these T cells and B cells, that means the first and second line of defense have already found something. And they're like, you know what? We're getting our butts kicked. We need the adaptive immunity to come up here and help us take care of this. So this macrophage says, hey, here it is. Somebody take care of this guy, right? So TH looks at it and says, oh no, you know, he starts worrying. He starts going and telling the other ones to do something. TH goes and talks to the B cell. TH shows it to the B cell and says, see this? Go do your thing. Attack this. So then B cell specifically does some things to attack that antigen. B cell does two things. What are the two things that the B cell does? Very good. Memory and plasma. Good. And what does the plasma make? A lot of little small things. Good. It makes a bunch of little antibodies, right? The antibodies go attack. What does memory do? Just kind of hangs out and says, okay, I'm going to let y'all go handle it this time. And I'm going to sit back and I'm going to remember it for next time. So the next time you ain't got to go through all these other steps. Memory cell just kicks in immediately, makes those antibodies, and starts attacking. Okay? Plasma makes antibody. Because antibodies are little small molecules compared to a big cell. Okay? The other thing that TH does is activates TC. Good. And what does C stand for? Cytotoxic. Okay, remember toxic, bad. Right? What does TC do? Good. Secretes little toxic chemicals to kill other cells. Very good. So that TC cell can go kill the bacteria that attacks you, or he can kill your cell that the bacteria's in just to get rid of the bacteria. He's pretty tough. You don't want to make him mad. So you got to make sure TH gives TC permission so he don't just start killing all the cells in your body. All right. Autoimmune disease. Good. Good. Only other thing that I spent time really talking about in this chapter was vaccinations. And I don't expect you to know a bunch of details on vaccinations, but you should understand a generic idea of how a vaccination works. It's artificial active immunity, meaning I give the body something artificial and activate the immune system, right? So for like the flu vaccine, you're not getting the flu. They don't put the flu in your arm. If they did, we'd all get the flu and nobody would get the flu shot. They just take one little piece of the flu virus. There's no way on earth that can make you sick. But that one little piece can activate your immune system, get your B cells to make memory cells. So then if the real flu comes and attacks you, that memory cell can start attacking it before it has a chance to really make you sick. I don't know if you guys have noticed, but there's a new commercial on TV now they've come out with where these two guys are playing basketball. And one of them says, I think I'm going to go get my flu shot. And the other one says, man, I'm not getting that. I heard you can get the flu from it. And then this this black lady walks up. And it's so stereotypical. It's just not really nice, but it's funny the way they do it. And she comes up and she says, Boy, don't you know better than that? You cannot get the flu from the vaccine, and she just starts working him over and fussing at him. But I like it because it's finally somebody trying to teach the general public that what your grandma says is not true. You cannot get the flu from the shot. You should all understand why, and you should teach other people. Yeah, we've already gotten into we have a shortage of the flu vaccine. So if you get an opportunity to get it and you want it, probably should go ahead and get it. I didn't the other day because I ran out of time, and now I wish I had. Okay. Okay. The vaccine is good for the entire flu season. That is why they do not give the vaccine in June. I probably would not be standing in line the first week of August to get my shot. But when they start really offering the flu shot, which is around the middle of September, that is when you should get the flu shot. And the flu shot will last you the entire season. Right. There are times when the flu mutates, but that ain't going to matter when you get your shot. If the flu mutates and it's a different strain, it don't matter if you got your shot in September or if you got your shot in February. You can get that other strain of the flu. Right, because your memory cell, your B cell that you made is against the other flu, and the virus mutated, ha-ha. And viruses do that a lot. That's how a regular old Staphylococcus aureus bacteria that's on all of our arms right now can become a flesh-eating bacteria. The bacteria mutated. It didn't have anything to do with it. It's not a mean bacteria. That one mutated. So that's what occurs there. You should get your flu shots between September and October. Please don't wait. Go ahead. The only thing I really want you to understand about immunization is the generic idea of how it works. You need to understand it's artificial, meaning it's not naturally getting the virus in or bacteria into you. It's artificial, and it's active. Active means that it activates the entire process of your immune system. It has to get phagocytes activated, so the TH will go give permission to the bees so they will make memory. So it's artificial and it's active. Well, it uses innate and adaptive because the APC is innate. So it uses both parts of it. It's artificial because somebody jabbed it in your arm, right? You didn't naturally get it. And it's active because it's activating everything. Okay? So did that jog your memory about the immune system? That is my goal. And we're all good. We're ready to study.